about the incidence of a tax, what we're talking about is who bears the burden of paying it. And unless one of the parties has either a perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic demand or supply curve, which you all know can't occur in real life. Unless that condition is met, then the burden is going to be apportioned between both the buyer and the seller, no matter who supposedly or nominally pays the tax. It doesn't matter whether the buyer pays the tax or the seller pays the tax at the point of sale. The fact is that both the buyer and the seller will bear the burden of the tax. Now, whoever has the more elastic curve is going to end up bearing more of the burden. To figure out how much of the burden falls on the buyer and how much falls on the seller, to analyze the problem of the tax, you begin by drawing the axes and the initial market. That's just supply and demand. And you're going to determine your starting price and your starting quantity, PE1 and, QE1, not QE2, dear Lord. And after you do that, you're going to shift the curve by the amount of the tax. So let's do that now. Draw the axes. Put in a supply curve, S1, a demand curve, B1, a quantity, and a price. After you've done that, you're going to put in your equilibrium quantity, QE1, and your equilibrium price, PE1. That's your starting point. Our next step is to add the amount of the tax. What you do to add the amount of the tax is you add the amount of the tax to each and every point of the supply curve. So you're shifting up by exactly the amount of the tax. My arrows were only in there for illustrative purposes. I'm going to take them out right now. Of course, if you were drawing this as a shift, you could do a nice, neat horizontal label or horizontal arrow. Your next step is going to be to identify the new equilibrium price and the new equilibrium quantity. Now that you've shifted the curve, you'll identify the new price paid by the buyers. That's the new equilibrium price. The buyers pay the new equilibrium price. But you also have to identify the seller's revenue. That's the new equilibrium price minus the amount of the tax. The new equilibrium price minus the amount of the tax. So P sub S, or the price sellers receive, is the new equilibrium price, PE2, minus the amount of the tax. Remember, our sellers don't get to keep that tax. The portion paid by the buyers will be the difference between the old selling price and the new selling price, multiplied by the number of units sold at the new price. So it's old price minus new price multiplied by the amount of items sold after the change in price due to the tax. So let's take a look at how that works. We're going to identify our new equilibrium price, our new equilibrium quantity. PE2, QE2, When that happens, we also need to identify the price that the seller gets to keep. That's the difference between PE2 and the amount of the tax. Remember, we shifted up this curve by the amount of the tax. So this distance between the new curve and the old curve is the amount of the tax. And that becomes the price the seller gets to keep, or P sub S. So the new equilibrium price is the price the buyer pays. Subtract the difference of the tax, and now you have the price the seller gets to keep. Now that we've identified all of our prices, the price the buyer pays, the price the seller keeps, and the new equilibrium quantity, what we're going to do is indicate our burdens. So the next step, take that back. We're going to look at deadweight loss. So deadweight loss is going to be whatever was left on the table that will never be created because of the new tax. Remember that it's going to be a triangular shape, which means you can use geometry to figure its area. So the amount of deadweight loss will be 1/2 of the quantity new equilibrium price minus the price the seller keeps, multiplied by the difference between the old quantity and the new quantity. And yes, I realize I'm missing a bracket. So going back to our graph, our area of deadweight loss will be the difference between the old price, or the old quantity, and the new quantity. And it's this area right here, that's our deadweight loss. On the other hand, part of this will be paid by the sellers. The portion paid by the sellers is going to be the portion that is below the old equilibrium price. If you take a look at this graph, you'll notice that we have two rectangles within the triangles that were our old consumer surplus and our old producer surplus. So the seller's burden is coming out of its old producer surplus. And it's this area here. It's going to be the area that's represented by the difference between the old price, the new price the seller gets to keep, all the way over to the new quantity and up. So it's the bottom rectangle here. If you forget the formula, don't forget that you can draw the graph. It's just a rectangle. That should help you to figure out the amount of the tax that the seller pays. The buyer, on the other hand, is going to be paying the difference between the price the buyer pays, that's the new equilibrium price, minus the old equilibrium price, multiplied by the quantity that's sold after the imposition of the tax. So that's this area that I'm about to color in. It'll be this area right here. New price down to old price, over to new quantity, up, fill in the rectangle. That's the part that the buyer pays. And there you go. That's how you determine the incidence of a tax. Whenever there's a tax, there's going to be deadweight loss unless the tax is correcting an externality. So remember, if it's a tax, there's deadweight loss unless there's an externality involved.